Iranian.
Some of that is sanctioned oil. It just requires the willingness to enforce those sanctions. And obviously that comes with a cost-benefit analysis. The Iranians are also capable of seizing ships and doing that in retribution. But that's certainly something that will be under consideration, and others have done that in the past. And we have seized, for example, weapons shipments in the past that involve Iranian and in fact, some of the ships, remember, all of these ships that we're seizing with the oil are with court orders. They're either one of two things. We either have a court order from a federal judge that allows us to seize it because it's in violation of a sanction, or it's a flagless vessel.
This may look like a technical discussion about oil shipments, but it's actually a stress test of how far enforcement authority can reach without crossing into open conflict. What's really being tested here is whether sanctions remain symbolic or become operational tools with real consequences. This raises broader questions about the balance between economic pressure and escalation, and how democracies apply power while claiming restraint. In this video, we'll break down how enforcement mechanisms are being justified, where the legal lines are drawn, and what this moment signals about global accountability.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, great to see you. Congratulations. What you and President Trump have demonstrated in the past year is clearly peace through strength, and I appreciate the leadership from both of you. We've talked a lot about Venezuelan oil. You know, I focus a lot on energy going to China, and 3/4 of all the oil that went from Venezuela out of the country there last year, 75% of it went to China. They got it at deep discounts. They lots of money back to Venezuela through oil for loan deals. Since the start of this blockade, basically Venezuela crude shipments to China have fallen dramatically. Can you assess or talk a little bit about the impact this has on China's broader energy strategy?
Just to be clear, it's a quarantine, not a blockade. A blockade is an act of war. It's a quarantine, and it's been very effective in the sense that it's given us this leverage. In fact, can I just add something, and this might be to Senator Murphy's question as well. The Venezuelan authorities are now identifying ships that they want us to grab. In fact, about a week and a half ago, we grabbed one of these ships. That was, because here's what happened in the aftermath of the Maduro. About 5 ships took off without authorization from the Venezuelans because they were controlled by some network in the country. With the cooperation of the interim authorities, we seized one of those ships. We brought it back into Venezuelan waters, handed the ship off to the Venezuelans, who in turn fed it into this mechanism, the short-term mechanism that I described to you was created. So we're seeing cooperation on that front. Now, I think your question more specifically was about China. Yeah, so look, China can buy Venezuelan oil, but they're going to have to buy it like everybody else in the world is going to have to buy it. Yeah, at the normal price. And that money is going to flow back to the benefit of the Venezuelan people in a structured way. And I know that in the short term, that will involve this mechanism we've described. In the long term, our intention is that it would be governed by a democratically elected government. You know, I mean, like a normal country would handle it. But it's not just about oil. There's other economic activity, the full spectrum. I mean, Venezuela was, and still, we're not talking about some third world country here. I mean, we're talking about a country that doesn't just have wealth, it has memory, it has history of economic activity, of people who own chains of pharmacies. I know some of these people, of people who own chains of retail stores, including American retailers who had a presence there. We just want it to be a normal, prosperous country again, not a playground for Iran, Russia, and China in our own hemisphere. And we're going to try to help them get that because we think it serves our national interest. That will require actions on our part, not money, but ultimately that will require them. This is ultimately going to be on the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan society and Venezuelan leaders to make this happen. We're going to be there to help and assist and create the parameters for it, and we feel like we're making really good progress. If we make as much progress over the next 4 weeks as we've made in the last 3.5 weeks, I'll feel very good about that. If it slows down or gets complicated, I'll certainly let you know. But our anticipation is that we're going to be able to continue to work cooperatively with them because it's in their interest and ours. But I will point out to this. After this operation happened, look at the people who criticized it. I mean, there were others. China, Russia, Iran, Hamas. These were the people that were upset about this strike and this raid and what we did. And I can tell you that in many countries in the Western Hemisphere, there was great pleasure in the fact that Maduro was removed and that it didn't involve an all-out war and an invasion.
Since you mentioned Iran, and Senator McCormick mentioned Iran as well, a lot of oil is still going from Iran to China. 1 million barrels a day last year. Lots of that money goes back to Iran, to the dictators, the people that are actually killing others on the street. Can you talk a little bit about what we can do to prevent that from continuing to go and what we're doing to support the Iranian?
Some of that is sanctioned oil. It just requires the willingness to enforce those sanctions. And obviously that comes with a cost-benefit analysis. The Iranians are also capable of seizing ships and doing that in retribution. But that's certainly something that will be under consideration, and others have done that in the past. And we have seized, for example, weapons shipments in the past that involve Iranian and in fact, some of the ships, remember, all of these ships that we're seizing with the oil are with court orders. They're either one of two things. We either have a court order from a federal judge that allows us to seize it because it's in violation of a sanction, or it's a flagless vessel in the shadow fleet. And many of these ships here involve Iran. And some of that oil was going to be ultimately transferred to the excess refining capacity that China currently has.
So you mentioned the word shadow fleet. Senator Shaheen and I have legislation on subsea cables. I've asked you about that the last time we were here. The sabotage being done, directly being targeted. I know that Sweden and Finland have both detained Russian ships along those lines. We're going to have a markup on that bill tomorrow. Is that something you continue to support our efforts to go after?
It is, and it's featured prominently in the agenda, both at the G7 this year, as it did somewhat last year, but again this year in the G7 will be one of the top items we'll be discussing. And we've also been pushing it as a priority for NATO to consider. The two new things we want NATO to make a priority this year in our conversations are the undersea cable infrastructure and Arctic security, and the third is critical minerals and supply chains, because ultimately you can spend all the money in the world on weapons. If you can't make them because you're missing some chip that requires some mineral that China controls, you're in a lot of trouble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kaine.
The moment landed with deliberate precision. When Secretary of State Marco Rubio paused to correct the language, insisting this was a quarantine, not a blockade, it was more than a semantic distinction. It was a signal. In Washington, words define limits of power. A blockade implies war. A quarantine implies control without escalation. And in that narrow space between the two, Rubio revealed how modern American power now operates. Force calibrated through legality, pressure applied through systems rather than spectacle. What followed was even more revealing. Rubio acknowledged, almost casually, that vessels tied to this shadow fleet had already been seized. Not hypothetically, not as a future option, but as a matter of record. Ships taken with court orders, ships without flags, ships moving oil through opaque networks designed to bypass accountability. This was not rhetoric. This was enforcement already underway. And it exposed a reality many Americans rarely see. That global influence today is exercised not only through speeches or sanctions, but through maritime control, judicial authority, and international coordination operating quietly beyond public view. Rubio's explanation laid bare the architecture of modern pressure. Oil shipments, once flowing at deep discounts to China, are now being redirected, slowed, constrained by a system that treats economic leverage as a strategic weapon. This is not about punishing markets. It is about restructuring them. For years, energy routes functioned as private highways for geopolitical influence, funneling resources through deals invisible to ordinary citizens. What this hearing revealed is that those routes are now being mapped, monitored, and, when necessary, interrupted. The shadow fleet is not just a collection of ships. It is a metaphor for a world where power moves in the dark. Vessels without flags, transactions without transparency, agreements without public consent. When Rubio described these ships as operating outside recognized norms, he was pointing to a deeper truth. That global order increasingly depends on whether rules can still be enforced against those who believe they no longer apply. And then came the line that crystallized the stakes. When asked about Iranian oil flowing to China, Rubio did not deny the scale. He confirmed it. He acknowledged the cost-benefit analysis, and he said plainly that seizing those vessels will be under consideration. That phrase matters, because it tells us enforcement is no longer theoretical. It is conditional, deliberate, and imminent if circumstances demand it. The United States is weighing not whether it can act, but when acting becomes necessary. This moment exposed a hard reality about leadership. Power is no longer about dramatic declarations. It is about quiet resolve, about legal authority exercised across oceans, about decisions that ripple through markets, alliances, and strategic balances long after the hearing room empties. Rubio emphasized that these actions are grounded in court orders and international law. That distinction matters, because legitimacy is the currency that allows power to endure. The hearing also revealed something else, an understanding that influence cannot be sustained through force alone. Rubio spoke of restoring normalcy, of rebuilding systems so that resources benefit people rather than networks, of ensuring that wealth flows through accountable structures rather than being siphoned through shadow arrangements. This is not idealism. It is pragmatism rooted in national interest. Stability, Rubio argued, serves both sides when it is real, structured, and lawful. Yet the tension remains. Enforcement carries risk. Retaliation is possible. Escalation is never off the table. Rubio did not minimize that. Instead, he framed it as a calculation, one that responsible leadership must confront rather than avoid. That is the burden of governance in an era where influence travels faster than law and where inaction carries consequences of its own. The discussion expanded beyond oil to infrastructure beneath the seas. Undersea cables, Arctic security, supply chains for critical materials. Each one a reminder that modern conflict does not begin with headlines. It begins with vulnerabilities, with dependencies, with systems taken for granted until they are threatened. Rubio's testimony connected these dots with clarity. You can fund defense endlessly, he warned, but without control over supply chains, power becomes hollow. What this hearing ultimately revealed is a government grappling with the complexity of its role, acknowledging limits, asserting authority, choosing precision over spectacle. The seizure of a single vessel may not make the evening news, but it signals something profound, that the rules are still being enforced, even when enforcement is inconvenient, contested, or costly. This is how accountability looks in real time. Not loud, not dramatic, but firm. Anchored in law, guided by strategy, and willing to act when words are no longer enough. In the end, the question is not whether power will be used. It is whether it will be used responsibly, whether systems will serve people or shadow networks, whether leadership will choose clarity over chaos. Moments like this hearing do not resolve those questions, but they reveal who is willing to confront them. And that is why this matters. If you believe transparency matters, if you believe accountability should reach even the darkest corners of global power, support our work to expose the truth. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA.